Okay, so welcome to today's online lecture associated with Biology 101, online, statewide. And today is session 8, and what we're talking about is the history of life, and we'll transition that into human evolution. And really, we've kind of been building up to this throughout the class. We started off with small things like chemicals and all that, and then transitioned us into genetics, which transitioned us into evolution. And now today we're talking about the consequences of that evolution, or how this all occurred. And we'll use one example at the end where we'll talk about human evolution. When session 8 is done, we go into sessions 9, 10, and 11, which explore the diversity of life that are all consequences of this evolution as well. And so let's go ahead and dive right in with our starting point here concerning the history of life. And we start off this with the geological timescale. The Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, and there's some variation. Some people say it's a little bit more, some people a little bit less. But really, when we're talking about the geological timescale, we're talking about this figure right here. And you can look at this in your PowerPoints or your book. You may not be able to see it very well now. But really, history is divided into these broad eras. And what defines these eras is not the absolute time as we see here, but the fossils we find and the evidence of life we find at these different points. And the reason for that is we didn't have all these chemical and physical means to define eras, to define the age of something in the past. Instead, what we had was the fossils that we could find. We could see that. And so the best example of this is probably right here at what's known as the KT boundary, or Cretaceous Tertiary. Even though Cretaceous is spelled with a C, we call it the KT boundary. And the thing is that at this point, the dinosaurs disappear. And so if you're looking at different rock layers and strata, what you'll see is that that is a big change in the fossil record. And so what we really see in this geological time scale is we can go back in time by getting deeper and deeper into rocks and find older and older fossils. And that may not be intuitive at first, but let's take a brief look at it here real quick. Let's imagine that you had an organism that died. Okay, and so we're going to draw an organism here, and it's upside down, so that means it's dead. And what happened is that it died someplace on the ground, but over time, dirt started to accumulate and bury it, okay? And if this seems like an odd sort of thing to happen, just think about what would happen if you dropped a pencil in a lawn outside your Ivy Tech campus. If you dropped that pencil there and you came back even just a couple weeks later, that pencil wouldn't be sitting on top of the grass. It would have gone a little bit into the grass, and it would have started working its way into the ground. And what we're going to see is things work their way into the ground, but also massive piles of dirt start to accumulate on top of it. And so what happens is, over time, we add more and more layers of dirt. And that means that maybe now we're here at this time. If we dig down through that dirt, we can say that things near the surface are relatively recent and things near the bottom are very old. And so in this picture from your book, what they're showing you is a nice example where if you look at these different layers in the mountains, as we go down this direction, what we see is we're getting things that are older and older and older. And the way that actually occurs is due to tectonic shifting, or the plates on the Earth, where something got buried at the bottom, but then the Earth shifted and exposed all those layers. And that's what you're seeing there. And so basically, a paleontologist can go find fossils in a given layer and say, they're about this many millions of years old. In the history of Earth, life is thought to have begun about 3.8 billion years ago, but for most of that time, or about 1.2 billion years of that, it was basically microscopic single-celled organisms. And so it will eventually, we'll see, lead to this great diversity of life. But how did life start to begin with? And life basically arose through a chemical process where simple elements and compounds on Earth came together to produce more complex molecules, and ultimately these became self-replicating. So if you want to think about this, life had to come from somewhere. It had to start somehow. And all life has one common ancestor at the very base of its tree. And what this common ancestor is, that marker's not working very well. What this common ancestor is, it is the first self-replicating, there we go, organism. And the way this worked is we had all these organic, non-biological molecules in the environment, and eventually they randomly assembled into something that was self-replicating. And if you remember our talk last week about evolution, if you have something that's self-replicating, and it can make errors sometimes, if you have different populations with different selective pressures, this can lead to this branching tree, right? So we've got a self-replicating molecule, and some of them are over here, and some of them over here, and some of them over here. If the selective pressures differ between these two locations, we can get the evolution of two different organisms. And as long as this trend continues, we can see the diversity of life that we do today. And it keeps going and going, and you see the tree goes up and up and up. The interesting thing about that is what this means is that all organisms on Earth are actually related to each other. Where you may be over here on the tree, but there's a bacteria over here, but if we go far enough back in time, we have the same common ancestor. And your book shows you a very famous experiment by Stanley Miller. And a lot of people look at this experiment and think, oh, we created life in the lab. Scientists have never actually created life. What we've managed to do with this experiment is to actually create organic molecules, things like amino acids, those basic building blocks of living things, which makes it possible for this random assemblage of life to start. And we already talked about how natural selection can act on those, and we've got the tree of life. Everything on Earth belongs to one of three domains, and we talked about bacteria and archaea earlier in the semester. Domains of bacteria and archaea are single-celled microbes, and they do not have a nucleus, which makes bacteria and archaea prokaryotes. In contrast, eukaryotes are composed of one or more cells that have a nucleus, and all of these members in this domain are eukaryotes. And so eukaryotes are things that you're a little bit more familiar with, like plants, animals, fungi, and this group of protists, which are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. And we will talk about these different groups in the next several sessions, as I mentioned earlier. This is just kind of an introduction to them, and we'll explore them further later. The setup is kind of like this. We have that universal ancestor that I was talking about. We get over to domain bacteria, and then we get the split between bacteria and what will become archaea and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes split off from the archaea, and really protists should be kind of at the base here, because these other multicellular large forms of life actually evolved from early protists. And life today can be conceptualized as beginning with a universal ancestor that produced an evolutionary line, leading to domain bacteria on one hand and to domains archaea and eukarya on the other. And we already talked about the protists, plants, and animals. One thing that I want to mention here is that a lot of times when people think about the history of the world, it's almost cast in this kind of story that eventually leads to humans. And that's kind of almost what we're doing here today, right? We're going to talk about the history of the world, and then in a moment in the next lecture portion, we're going to break into the history of human life. And that's really not a good way to view it, because all organisms are going through this history of the world, and all organisms have evolved to get where they are today. And so if we look at this kind of figure that I drew over here, we put humans on one branch, and we're going to tell the story of humans today. But we just as easily could have told the story of bacteria. We could have told the story of turtles. We could have told the story of worms. But we're going to tell the story of humans. Humans aren't any better or worse. They're just the branch that we're concentrating on today. And there's a very good reason for that. As we are humans, there's an incredible amount of interest in the evolution of humans, and so we have a lot more fossils and things that we can talk about today in that regard. One thing to point out is, oops, jumped into the wrong lecture there. One thing to point out is, oh, sorry, now we're going to go through kind of the different eras, starting with the Precambrian. And so we're going way back here, and we're going to kind of work our way up through some major developments in each of these times. And the Precambrian is basically, we can look at some older organisms that we find there that are abundant, but they're still not very complex. We still just have bacteria and archaea. And we don't really have actual fossils of these things because they're so small, we would never be able to find that. But what we do find is the remnants where we can show high concentrations of carbon. And carbon, remember, it's in the atmosphere and stuff like that. But if you remember our biological molecules, biological organisms assimilate a lot of carbon. And by assimilating that carbon into their bodies, when we find these high concentrations of carbon in these rock layers, what that tells us is that living things must have been there. One of the notable events of the Precambrian is where photosynthesis begins to be performed. And this is a critical event. And if you remember, and we'll talk about this when we talk about plants, we talked about it a little bit before when we talked about things like ATP and energy usage a few weeks ago. But plants did a couple very important things. One, plants provide the basis for the food for all life on Earth. And so, got to jump over here to grab a eraser. If we think about it, even you yourself owe your life to plants. And so we're going back to our carbon cycle that I promised you we'd talk about all semester. And we start off with the sun. And the sun shines down onto plants. Those plants are taking in CO2 and sending out oxygen. And what's happening is those carbons are getting stored inside sugars inside the plants. And the plants can generate their own ATP, or they can store it in the sugars, and for you to live, you can eat this plant, right? You could eat that and you'd be happy, and you can go back to, if you want to see about how all the energetics and stuff works, you can go back to the previous lecture. But you could also eat something that eats this plant to survive as well. And so, really, plants form the basis of the food chain. But what they do in the history of evolution that's probably more important than even that, well, they're both important, is that I told you here they're taking in CO2 and sending out oxygen. And if you recall from our lecture on energetics, when you eat something, you can generate 32 to 38 ATP in the presence of oxygen, but only around 2 without it. And what this means is that in the presence of oxygen, for every bite of food you take, you get 16 times as much energy. And it's this oxygen in the atmosphere that ultimately makes large multicellular organisms like you possible. Without this high amount of oxygen for aerobic respiration, there's no way you could maintain your life. And you can think about this in terms of how important oxygen is to you, right? If I was to strangle you, you would die, right? And you die because of a lack of oxygen because you're not able to make enough ATP to keep your individual cells alive. And again, if you go back to an earlier lecture on energy in sessions, around sessions 4 or 5, you can see kind of this story in a little bit more detail. And so plants, for both those reasons, have made your life possible. And this is just saying that we benefited from, early eukaryotes benefited from that oxygen. And really, we go from prokaryotes, which are very simple cells, to eukaryotes, because of something very interesting. And that is an event of endosymbiosis. That's a fancy word that means this. How do we go from a very simple organism with really no organelles inside, a prokaryote, to a eukaryotic cell that we learned about earlier in the semester that's so complicated? Well, the way we do that is we started off with an early cell. And that cell, as part of its life cycle, was trying to eat another small bacteria cell, a smaller bacteria. And that bacteria ended up inside the larger cell. And normally, this larger cell should have digested this for all the nutrients and good stuff that was inside. But at some point, it didn't digest it. And instead, this little guy, like any parasite, went on to survive and reproduce inside the larger cell. And now, normally, this would be a disadvantage, but it could also be an advantage. Because in this case, this cell is going to, in order to survive, is going to take in sugars and generate ATP, which organisms need. And over time, both this little guy inside this cell is evolving, and this one is evolving, and every time it divides and reproduces, the big one, some of those little ones go along with each cell. And over time, these become more and more specialized because they're having good survival and reproduction inside this larger cell. And ultimately, we're telling the story here of mitochondria. Inside your cells right now, you have mitochondria, which have their own DNA, their own replication, and every time your cells divide, they're passed on. And so you, in all your cells right now, you actually have another almost foreign organism that is working in conjunction with your cells because both organisms benefit. The mitochondria get to survive and reproduce and pass on their DNA, and through you having them, you're better able to survive and reproduce and pass on your DNA. Moving on to the Cambrian Explosion. Living things began to diversify a lot around 635 million years ago, and that's where we get the appearance of the ancestors of modern animals. And so now we're just working up our way in this chart. And all life started in water. And this is important, because what this meant is we had the world, and it was only full of organisms at this point in the water. And there was all this land that was available for organisms to move to. But you know, how did this happen? Well, there's going to be a few transitionary steps. But if we start off, imagine this is water going up to a coast. And you've got the water level here, and you've got a bunch of aquatic plants living down here. And life in the water is pretty easy. Except for the fact that you've got lots of plants down here, and there's high amounts of competition. And what happens is, you guys know how tides come in and out and in and out. What that means is up here, there's a portion of the day where things are wet, and there's a portion of the day where things are dry. And what happens is you get some of these algae, which are going to be the ancestors of plants, that are okay at resisting that desiccation. They develop a waxy cuticle that makes them less prone to drying out. And so what that means is they can exist in this area where there's no other competition for resources because all the other aquatic plants are down here, and they can survive those dry times, and so we get things like mosses that can survive on land. Keep in mind, mosses still, though, require a lot of water. Think about mosses and where you find them. You find them in most moist environments. Mosses only get about yay big as well. And there's a reason for that. Mosses have to suck all their water up like a sponge because they don't have a vascular system. And that's where another interesting event occurs in the evolution of plants. Is eventually they're able to survive farther away from the water, But then one day there are some of them that can grow a little taller than the others. And when you can grow a little taller than the others, that means that you can get the sunlight more directly, and you're going to have better survival and reproduction. And so this, what we're talking about here, is basically the evolution of vascular elements that allow plants to get taller and taller. And so ferns have these vascular elements. But then if you think about where ferns are, you find them in moist, damp environments. And these ferns in the moist, damp environments are required to be there simply because of the fact that they still require water for reproduction. They have not evolved complex things like seeds and pollen, which allow them to survive in to reproduce in a totally dry environment. And we'll learn a little bit more about that evolution of seeds and pollen when we talk about plants in, I believe, session 10. And so plants move on to land, and they develop that water-retaining covering that we mentioned. And it kind of follows this transition. We start off with green algae. They become more resistant to desiccation, but we still have little mosses, very moist. We get ferns. They can grow taller, but still require water for reproduction. And then we get this evolution of seeds and pollen over here, which leads to angiosperms largely becoming dominant across the surface of the Earth. And so, interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, at this point we have a world with a whole bunch of plants on it now. But where are all the animals? And the answer to this is, animals could not survive on land before there were plants there. Remember what we drew over here where all life depends on plants? If there's nothing for animals to eat on the land, they can't get there. And so plants move on to land, and then animals follow them onto land. And when I talk about animals, a lot of you are probably thinking about, oh, well, gee, bears, tigers, birds, things like that. Keep in mind that animals also includes things like insects, sea stars, and all sorts of stuff. And we'll learn more about that in session 11 when we talk about animal diversity. But those first animals that move on to land are going to be arthropods, which are basically centipede-like creatures, insects, and they enter this world full of plants with nothing else there, right? They had all this competition in the water, but once they get onto land, there's all these open niche dimensions. And so they're able to diversify incredibly. But for millions of years, arthropods are the only land animals. And then we do get to the vertebrates moving on to land. And we kind of showed you how plants made their journey onto land a moment ago. And animals have a very similar story. They start off, I shouldn't say animals, I should say vertebrates have a very similar story. They start off in the water. They're down here. And they're fish. Okay? There's a lot of competition in this water. But there's also a bunch of yummy stuff on the water's margins. And so fish that are able to grab this yummy stuff on the water's margins are better able to survive and reproduce. And so any adaptation that allows them to grab these resources means they have higher fitness. And so over time, through many mutations, we start to get developments in fish that lead to things like lobed fins. Fins that kind of let them flop around in the mud a little bit to get that stuff that's up here. And eventually, flopping around in the mud, if you go a little bit farther, there's all these things that, again, nothing else is eating over here. And so we go through these stages to get to the evolution of what will ultimately become legs. And we get tetrapods. Tetrapods basically just means four-legged organisms. The first examples of these to make it onto land are amphibians. But remember how we talked about plants and they still have that evolutionary tie to water in some groups, like the mosses and ferns? Same thing with amphibians, right? Amphibians are tied to water. If you think about a frog, they still have to go back to water to reproduce. Reptiles are ultimately able to break this association. And they're able to do that through the development of eggs. Reptile eggs have a thick outer coating like bird eggs, like a shell, but they're still just a little bit squishy. And it's mostly because they lay their eggs in the ground and they don't sit on them to incubate them. And so this story is going to take us from amphibians to reptiles, and then from reptiles, we are going to move on to the evolution of both mammals and dinosaurs and birds, which are actually part of the same group. And a while ago, if this had been 10 or 20 years ago, and I said, are birds related to dinosaurs? Most of you probably would have said, no, they're totally different. One's more like a reptile, and the other one flies, it has feathers. However, the movie Jurassic Park has done some of our work for us, where they basically popularized this idea that birds are related to dinosaurs. And when you think about dinosaurs, you think about big, giant thunder lizards, as their name implies. But there were also many, many, many small dinosaurs. There were dinosaurs the size of chickens. There were dinosaurs smaller than that. And so it's not like every dinosaur is this giant monster. Many of them were small. And if we take a theropod dinosaur, those are those dinosaurs that walk on two legs, what we can see is that they're very, not surprisingly, like birds. Let's draw the basic body plan of a dinosaur, like a Tyrannosaurus rex, right? You've got the big legs, big hip region, a body with a mouth at the top and a tail. That's basically the body plan of a Tyrannosaurus rex. Here's how we turn this into a bird. We lose our tail and add some wings. That's it. And we can see the exact same sorts of bones and where they're located and the shapes of the feet, all these connections between dinosaurs and birds that help us see that they are, in fact, related to dinosaurs. This other group that we have coming off of here is the mammals. And mammals started off as insect-eating organisms, and they evolved from reptiles. Think about the reptiles, When you think about most reptiles, they're carnivorous, meaning they eat other animals or other things that are not plants. Herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat meat. And so we started out, so mammals started out as these insectivorous mammals that ran around eating insects. And what we end up with is the diversification of that group. About 75 million years ago, 10 million years prior to the demise of the dinosaurs, we see most of the basic forms of vertebrate mammals, of mammals. And what I mean by that is we may not have a whole bunch of different kinds of bears, like polar bears, brown bears, and black bears, but we have the basic bear body plan. And over about the next 20 million years, the dinosaurs will go extinct, and we'll start to see some diversification of mammals occurring. And one of those diversifications comes about 55 million years ago with this weird-looking mammal that has large front-facing eyes, limbs with opposable digits, and they hang out a lot in trees. And those are early primates. And so with primates, we now transition into our next chapter on the history of human evolution. Eventually, this one line in these primates will lead to us. And so let's go ahead and make that transition right now. Oh, can't quite grab it there. There we go. So, the human family tree. Oh, actually, do you guys have any questions at this point? I'm going to take the silence to indicate no. Okay, oh great, you just typed it there. Awesome, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and cruise on through the family tree then. And human evolution is the study of the taxonomic grouping, which name I always butcher because there's so many I's and N's there, but it's Hominini. That's probably the one time I'll ever get it close. And members of this group are referred to as hominims, and they include human beings. A common primate ancestor is believed to have given rise to both chimpanzees and the human family evolutionary lines between 6 and 7 million years ago. And keep in mind that this is subject to a great deal of debate. And the reason for this is we don't have time machines. We just can't go back in time and see what was going on with these different organisms. What we're left to do is interpret the fossil evidence. And so this is an example of the hominin family tree. The earliest and the line that we really start to pay a lot of attention at is with this Australopithecus afarensis. This fossil is known as Lucy. And that's going to be kind of the first largely bipedal organism that we see leading to modern humans. And again, because we don't have a total fossil record, a lot of this is subject to argument, conjecture, things like that. But we've got a pretty good idea. We may not have it perfect, but we know we're close to having it figured out. All the members in the hominin grouping are extinct except for Homo sapiens. We are the only one that made it through, and most of our evolution took place in Africa. And for a while it was believed that everything took place right here in this region of Africa, but as people have found and done more anthropaleontologist things going around, we found other sites elsewhere where we see hominin evolution occurring. It's almost all going to take place in Africa until relatively recently, but it all started here. We've been able to use molecular evidence in human evolutionary studies, and this is simply because we can use what's known as a molecular clock. And what a molecular clock is we can look at the rate of mutations that occur over time. And basically by looking at the number of mutations between two groups of organisms, we can then get an estimate of how long ago it was that they split. And so really, because human evolution is a relatively recent phenomenon, this evolutionary clock, or sorry, this clock is able to give us an idea about how long ago these things occurred. But our main evidence still is fossils. And we find things like this. This was in all these little fragments, and they assembled it again. And this is just like CSI. If you've ever watched CSI, where they find a skull buried and like, we're going to reconstruct what this person looked like, that's exactly what you can do with a whole organism. And you can do that because every marking or surface on a bone, it's not just random, it has meaning. And what I mean by that is, if you find a large knob or projection on a bone, it's probably because something attached there. And so we can do a reasonably good job of reconstructing what an organism may have looked like from just finding its bones. And when I say finding its bones, you should keep one important thing in mind. For human evolution, we do find a lot of bones. They're still bones. For the stuff I was talking about before, the history of the world, what you actually find are bone-shaped rocks. And the reason for that is that when something dies and it starts to get buried, minerals leach into those bones. And what happens is all the organic matter from those bones decays, but what's left is those minerals that filled that space. And so when paleontologists dig up bones from a long time ago, what they're really digging up in most instances is bone-shaped rocks. As far as humans, though, if we're talking about relatively recently, we're still finding bones. The older and farther you go back, then you're actually finding those rocks that I was talking about before. There are two important defining characteristics described by your book in the evolution of hominins. And these are, first of all, tooth structure. Tooth structure is important because it can tell you a whole bunch about what an organism did for its life. So for instance, if you find an organism with sharp pointy teeth right here like this, it probably tells you it was a carnivore, that it ate meat. But if you find big grinding teeth, it tells you that it was probably an herbivore that had to grind up plant matter. And so, not even in just human evolution, in evolution of all tetrapods, including things like mammals, we see that the teeth are going to be a critical structure for us to identify and understand. In fact, for some fossils that are important in human evolution, all we have is a lower jaw and some teeth. And we have to kind of build the whole organism around knowing just that. But what's probably more interesting and important is this bipedal or upright walking. And really, how many mammals can you think of that walk upright like us, that walk like this? Not many. Most organisms are running around on, mammals are running around on 4 legs. And this is going to be key to human evolution. And what's going to happen is that these species are going to start off being able to come down from the trees and start to have an existence on the plains. And when they're on the plains, they start using 2 legs instead of 4. And what that does is it frees up your hands. And freeing up your hands is a pretty amazing thing. What happens is that when your hands are free, you're able to manipulate objects, carry babies, do things. But that's just not all. Because in addition to becoming upright, we start to get the evolution of things like opposable thumbs, which enable us to manipulate objects. And as we can get to manipulate objects, it changes what we can do with our brain. Because if you're just an animal running around on 4 legs, your brain development, maybe you're say a fox. You might get a little bit better strategy or doing something, but really you're kind of limited to what you're already doing. With hands, we can manipulate objects and do so many things. So as this all is happening, we're seeing a lot of natural selection for intelligence. The brain size, the cranium size, is increasing, and brains are also simultaneously becoming more complex, and we're getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And it's really this upright walking and thumbs in tandem with your brain that really drives the evolution of hominins and ultimately us, Homo sapiens. Another thing about teeth that I should mention here is that teeth are great for the fossil record because they tend to be very well preserved. If you think about all the bones in your body everywhere, only these guys are have some function external to the body, as in that you're bringing the external world into your mouth to chew and do things. And so teeth tend to be much harder, much more durable, and very well preserved in the fossil record. So, let's look at a couple hominins from the past. And the first one is that Australopithecus afarensis that I told you about, whose most famous individual is this fossil known as Lucy from 3.18 million years ago in Ethiopia. And you can kind of see trends toward getting to modern humans already in Lucy. And if you look at this picture, this almost looks like a little person, right? But we still aren't totally upright walking. The arms are still longer than the legs. We still see that smaller brain, and the thumbs aren't totally opposed yet. And so basically what we're getting toward is we're becoming more human-like. We're taking that adventure that I was telling you about through upright walking thumbs and brains. And basically, we also see several other things going on here through this evolution. We see probably a greater emphasis over vision over smell. For instance, think about how well you can smell relative to a dog. We start to become more visually oriented. We start to lose body hair. Males and females lose sexual dimorphism. They start to become more and more alike. And we also see an increasing duration of parental care, right? Because if you're intelligent, passing on that cultural knowledge becomes more important. And you're also able to take care of offspring in a much more elaborate fashion. And we definitely see this directional selection for increased cranial capacity. And that was that story that I was already telling you. So the hominins that we're looking at, one of them is Homo neanderthalis. Neanderthals populated Europe as well as parts of Asia for about 130,000 years. And they die out about 28,000 years ago. And your modern idea about caveman comes from Neanderthals. And Neanderthals are on a separate line from humans. If we jump back up really quickly to this figure, we get the line from Neanderthals over here and the line from humans over here. So there's a common ancestor. And humans and Neanderthals were actually close enough to each other genetically to still interbreed. We have genetic evidence that humans were mating with Neanderthals. However, remember we talked about those reproductive isolating mechanisms in the last lecture? They were still very different looking from us. They were more robust. They had thicker bones. They were less intelligent with smaller brains. And they existed there for a long time. They were still more primitive than humans. But what happens is that humans have been in Africa this whole time, and they start to leave Africa. And humans go and start to spread around the world. And as humans spread around the world, what we see is this occurring something to 55 to 85,000 years ago. We get migrations all over the place. And so we've evolved here, and then we start to spread. And one of the things that occurs is our spread into these regions that were populated by Neanderthals over here and Homo erectus over here. And what's going on is that we were in Africa, we evolved to be very smart, and we go to these regions where there's things that are just like us. In the case of Neanderthals, we can even still mate with them, but they're different. And they're competing with us for resources. They want to eat the same things we do. They want to hunt the same things we do. They want to gather the same things we do. And that's a problem. Because if you think about even just human history, right? We know of instances, for instance, in North America, Native Americans, tribes would war with each other. In Africa, tribes were warring with each other. All over the world, we find tribes warring with each other. And now we end up with that same sort of situation, where there are tribes that could be warring with each other. Now, Neanderthals had some tools, and humans had some tools, but humans were far more advanced. And so evidence indicates that there were two reasons Neanderthals left. One, we were smart enough to outcompete them for resources, and two, we probably directly killed them off in things like tribal wars. And the reason we were able to do that is our brains. We were more intelligent, so we drove them extinct. We have Homo erectus fossils from 750,000 years ago. 750,000 years, Homo erectus was existing just fine on its own. We leave Africa, go up there, we drive them extinct as well for very similar reasons. And so we are the last hominin standing by virtue of the fact that our development of brains occurred at a much more rapid pace than these other groups, and we killed them off. And this is that I just mentioned, by outcompeting them after we migrated. And your book ends this story of human evolution with a recent discovery of what's been called the Hobbit people. And in 2004, researchers reported finding fossils who were of hominins that were only about 3 feet tall and survived up until 18,000 years ago. So relatively recent history. And some of this has been challenged. And they're saying, oh, they were just some humans with a disease. However, that's been totally debunked now. Your book's a little bit behind the times on that. People have been trying to pose all these different diseases that these guys could have had. But the problem is that none of them are consistent with humans today that have these diseases. We look at a person with this disease, it doesn't match up with those fossils. And so that research has been largely missed. And so we have this other species. We don't know why they went extinct. There's less evidence that humans would have driven these guys extinct, although that is also a possible idea, like other hominids. And so with that, we have basically reached our 50-minute mark here, and we are at the end of the presentation. Did you guys, before we sign off for the day, have any questions? If you have them, you're welcome to use voice, and I see the note there that you guys are doing well. Okay, and so as I mentioned a couple times in the presentation, what we're going to do next week is we're going to explore this further, and we're going to take all this history that we talked about in the first part of the lecture, and we'll look at the diversity of organisms around the world. And so you can always find a recorded version of this if you want on the website where you signed up to join this one. If you just scroll down, you'll find this video actually recorded and probably posted later today if you want to review it. And there's also another version of this lecture that was recorded last semester, and you could maybe look at another one if you were interested. So with that, I will kick you guys out of the group and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No problem at all. You're very welcome.